110, it's the Total Liberation Action research team, and they're sort of having more of like a roundtable discussion about activism and how to be able to realize that. So this is not the only room that talks are taking place in. So if you're interested in that, feel free to go to those rooms. This room is going to be sort of on the intersection of disability studies and animal liberation. And so the next term for it is eco-ability. So if you're interested in that, obviously stay here, and we're going to get started in like a second.
And my essay that I want to share with you today is called Repealing the Fallacy of Emotion in Non-Human and Disability Media Discourse. In this presentation, I will explore the ethical and pragmatic implications of using an appeal to emotion, in particular, the fallacy of fear and appeal to pity as motivators of social change within fundraising and public service announcements. One of the most visible mediums used by organizations to achieve this end in advertisement, in particular television advertisements. Citing commercials used by the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, or the ASPCA, in their End Animal Abuse Crusade, and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention's campaign for tips from former smokers. I will explore the ideologies as being more injurious than helpful to non-human animals and people with disabilities. While these advertisements intend to emotionally rouse the viewer into eliciting social change, I argue that they reinforce the othering of both animals and people with disabilities. So the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle posited pity and fear as the principal emotions aroused by tragedy, and often used these are often used in argumentation to persuade viewers. The art of persuasion is typically executed using three basic appeals that Aristotle first described in his writings centuries ago. First, there's logos, or the appeal to reason, ethos, or the appeal to ethics, and pathos, or the appeal to emotion. The ads that I'm about to discuss with you are the very embodiment of pathos in particular. Pathos represents an appeal to the emotions of an audience. Appealing to emotion often relies upon using vivid images in the arguments, or ads. Language and images that are emotionally charged are often used illegitimately in ads, often as a substitute for logical and/or ethical appeals. If one uses emotionally charged language or examples simply to upset or anger an audience, one would argue that emotion is being used illegitimately. So when it comes to understanding using emotion illegitimately or in tragic ways, what's more tragic than the commercials that depict the poor, helpless, beaten and battered dogs and cats? They're often locked in cages, some missing eyes, others missing limbs. The close-ups on their pathetic, forlorn faces evoke in us a deep sigh of pity, a gasp of disgust, or the visceral urge to change the channel. These are the hallmark ads used by the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals in their animal abuse campaign. The ads typically feature a musical accompaniment by Sarah McLachlan, who sings the deeply moving Angel Ballad. The main claim of the commercial is that there are helpless, abused, and disabled non-human animals out there that can be rescued if the viewer just simply pledges money to help these pitiful creatures. It's even posited, will you be an angel for an animal today? Right now there's an animal who needs you, Sarah McLachlan says. So these ads in particular do not attempt to present information in a way that appeals to the viewer's sense of reason. An appeal to reason is a calm, often calm, based in facts and direct observation, and is swayed and set up by evidence, not passion. Incorporating the appeal to reason or logic shows the viewer that your position is well thought out and not based on personal belief. An argument based on logos appeal typically does not have biased assumptions built into the argument that go unchecked. One could argue that public awareness campaigns or campaigns to raise money, such as these, do not simply depict helpless, victimized, non-human animals, but also produces them. That is, the way we talk about and create images of certain groups of beings says something about who or what that being is and what it does. I'd even argue that when a being is seen as uncontrolled, say as pitiful or abused, then the being is understood as undisciplined. For these non-human animals, their undisciplined selves resulted in their uncontrolled reality, thus by presenting or producing their bodies as a site of pity or tragedy. Likewise, I'm sure you've all seen the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention's campaign for tips from former smokers. These are the ads on television. There's also images as well. The ads feature real people, not actors, many dealing with smoking-related diseases and disabilities such as diabetes, blindness, cancer, kidney failure, and amputation. The majority of the ads rely upon scare tactics, vividly depicting the horrific consequences of smoking, and their intent is to serve as a wake-up call to current smokers. The ads candidly describe the losses from smoking and the gains from quitting. Interestingly, the director of the CDC, Thomas Frieden, said in a recent interview, quote, "The TIPS campaign works because it shows the reality of smoking. It shows suffering, disability, disfigurement, and people not able to go about their daily lives." He continued to say, "Although they may be tough to watch, the ads show people living with real, painful consequences from smoking. For every one person who dies from tobacco, 20 are disabled or disfigured or have a disease that is unpleasant, painful, and expensive." This is coming from the director. I argue that projecting people and depicting people with disabilities in this fashion certainly lends itself to constructing the concept of the other. The concept of the other, as developed in feminist theorizing, is useful for understanding the social position of not only people with disabilities, but also non-human animals in these commercials. Central to the process of othering is the process of projecting rejected aspects of oneself onto those who are designated as the other. When one makes a person or being an other, one groups them together as the objects of one's experience instead of regarding them as subjects of experience with whom one might identify. One comes to see them primarily as symbolic of something else, usually but not always something that one rejects or fears. To the non-disabled human, for example, people with disabilities, whether they're human or not, symbolize, among other things, imperfection, abnormality, and disease. These individuals are depicted as fractured rather than as whole subjects with lives and futures that should not be pitied or feared. So perhaps at this point you may be asking, well, what's so bad about pity? What's wrong with pity? Well, pity expresses a negative evaluation of the situation of others and is generated usually when we believe someone is suffering from substantial misfortune. Pity is projected onto non-human animals and humans alike. So for example, as soon as one finishes watching an ASPCA ad, the distinction between those we perceive as suffering and those who do not suffer is made. Also, the difference between seeing and looking is made, thus creating a spectacle out of suffering. This spectacle of suffering occurs when unfortunate beings, or so-called unfortunate beings, are observed by those who do not share in their suffering and who do not experience it directly, and who as such may be regarded as fortunate beings. Those perceived as unfortunate are objectified, pitiful things to be on display, and thus become the elements of spectacle and freakery. The lives of both people with disabilities and non-human animals are considered less in such a situation because their bodies and minds are considered less. To be pitied is to actually look and feel bad at another, the other. Thus, pity is an emotion that's rooted in sight. It does not take any other factors into account. The position of pity may stem from one's belief that the other's position is unalterably inferior and or the other person is somehow responsible for their inferior position. Owning to the belief in the other's inferiority, pity may easily insult or humiliate the recipient. That's why most people do not like to be pitied. When one is the object of pity, people confer that they lack something and are therefore regarded as inferior. Pity implies a feeling of superiority and satisfaction with one's own position in relation to the other. Where's that? Have a minute? Oh, I will. Okay. Okay, good. Okay, so let's see. These types of arguments can capture an audience and influence their feelings. That's mostly why they're used in advertisement. But they tend to lack substance and dissolve when inspected critically. Emotional appeals, such as the appeal to pity, must be used with caution. However, as if they are poorly done, they can be manipulative and alienating. The fact is that most people with disabilities in particular already feel alienated and isolated due to the nature of their treatment as being less than normal and less capable than others. Self-pity, self-hate, shame, and other manifestations of being treated and portrayed in this manner are devastating, for they prevent people with disabilities from knowing their true selves, their real needs, and their real capabilities. The use of emotional appeals, in both examples, often oversimplifies complicated issues and really should not be used. Emotional appeals also draw on stereotypes to manipulate the audience's emotional fears. Tragedy arouses not only pity, but also fear, because the audience can envision themselves within the cause and effect chain. It plays upon the fear that, in particular, that non-disabled people have about the disabled body by stressing the terror and tragedy associated with bodily difference. So in these commercials I was talking about with the CDC, the bodies are often missing limbs, they're missing teeth, they're missing hair, and they're often scarred. And all of these images are signs of what people, non-disabled people often fear about disability. They invite the viewer to feel disgust as if their bodies and cause them to fear that this could possibly happen to themselves. Emotional appeals are often effective as a rhetorical device, but are generally considered naive or dishonest when used in such arguments and advertisements, because they often appeal to the prejudices of the listener rather than offer a sober assessment of the situation. Finally, talking about the final part of a persuasive approach, coming from Aristotle, we have ethics, the appeal to ethics or ethos. And this is based on the audience's perception of the speaker and the content of the argumentation. Ethos appeals to the audience by creating an atmosphere of trust. For example, an advertisement may seem more credible if it were to admit to bias, but then would maybe go on to argue a point logically. Or such an ad could be one where the advertisers tell the viewers that they've researched the topic and that their point of views are accurate. The art of using ethos successfully requires that you not only pay attention to how credible your sources are, but to how you're using them and how the language you're using may offer up communication strategies that possibly could confer agency and self-determining principles to all parties involved. The appeal to ethics, which I support, tends to approach a situation in terms of what is right for everyone that's involved, and it tends to make the viewer think about the greater good and what should be done to serve it. So while I agree that educational programs geared toward encouraging smokers to quit and supporting non-human animals, they're ideal, of course, the problem is the way in which the information is disseminated. In both cases, the beings being portrayed are to be feared, loathed, and avoided. This is precisely the prejudice sentiment that so many scholars and activists have been working to correct. These ads cater to the unfashionable value systems that promote hatred, contempt, and loss of self-esteem and agency. They deploy myths contrary to the truth about animals, non-human animals, and people with disabilities. Relying on pity and falsehoods about these beings muddies their issues rather than clarifies the reality of their lives. So, in conclusion, even in advertisements where pathos and logos is predominant, advertisers can work to promote positive messages about people with disabilities and non-human animals by possibly constructing ads that are more credible or going towards the ethos perspective or ethics perspective. And they can also utilize logic and rational supporting evidence to be successful. Advertisers could emphasize compassion and agency rather than contempt and pity. So I'll just leave you with a few questions. Do we really need to use up these non-humans' last shred of dignity by thrusting these visceral, demoralizing, and deathly images into our faces in these advertisements? Isn't there another way of rallying support than by stating that the helpless non-human animals of the world are deserving of our pity and therefore our compassion? Should fear be the prime reason, or fear or pity be the prime reasons that humans take action on these issues? And I believe there's something morally reprehensible about trying to manipulate other people's emotions and actions specifically on the basis of pity and fear. Furthermore, I believe better decisions are made when the heart and mind both agree on the action, not when it's manipulated to do so. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker will be Fantaske. She's a master's student in communication and culture, and her presentation's on the disabled body and the animal body.
Okay. Oh, that's fine. So, I just wanted to start my, this is a broken one. Of course it is. Okay, that's a million times better, thank you. So I just want to start with some definitions before I really get into the argument of the commonalities between speciesism and ableism. And I'm focusing on how these connect within the slaughterhouse setting. So here I have my definition of disability, which is whether a person can function in a way that is expected either by society or by themselves. And it's important to make this distinction at the end because a lot of times disability is defined by others and not the person who might have the condition. So for example, someone might use a wheelchair, and I just want to make a side note here that when talking about people who use wheelchairs, you never say wheelchair bound or anything related to that. It's something that they are using. So that's just an important distinction to make. But a person could be using a wheelchair or any sort of mobility device like a cane and not see themselves as disabled if they are happy with the way that they function day to day within society. But other people might look at them and they see that visual cue of the wheelchair or the cane and they immediately relegate them to the category of disabled. And this relegation then ends up disabling the person when they face social barriers created by this othering, of placing them in another category. So, for example, the person who's in a wheelchair can't enter a building because there's no ramp. On the other hand, we have disabilities that are considered invisible, and I take issue with the term invisible, but that's another conversation for another day. So people who don't use these mobility aids that are visual cues that they might be disabled oftentimes are not viewed by society as disabled persons. So I can sometimes be one of these people on days where I feel pretty good and I don't feel the need to have my brace on or use a cane. I can pass as able-bodied. However, I define myself as disabled primarily because I am not meeting my own expectations of what I want and what I want to do, and therefore I feel disabled by my conditions. So the definition of ableism that I've included here is, again, my definition, And it's an ideology, and an ideology is a belief system, a large belief system, which makes assumptions of worth and value based on a being's mental or physical capabilities. And I have another quote here that's somewhat more elegant than mine, which states that ableism is a form of bigotry that values non-disabled people over disabled people. It is also part of a system that segregates, excludes, and denies disabled people our basic rights to social, economic, political, and architectural access. It becomes internalized with the result that disabled people learn to feel ashamed of our bodies and minds as wrong, tragic, broken, pitiful, like you were disgusting, and freakish. And lastly, I have a quote from Wolbring, who is a disability rights activist who also looks at speciesism and the commonalities between the two. And this person I really admire and will be quoting a few times. They state that ableism reflects the sentiment of certain groups and social structures that value and promote certain abilities over others. So really quickly, some examples of ableism. I gave the one of a person who uses a wheelchair not being able to enter a building, but there's so many more than that. There's the assumption of poor quality of life. So that is, people assume that living a life with a disability is not worth living. Also, the sterilization, forced sterilization of people with disabilities. This is not something that is in our past. It is happening right now. More often than not, it is people with cognitive disabilities who don't communicate in a way that is expected, and thus these sort of operations are carried out without their consent, and this is illegal. So here I have a quick definition of humanism, which is equal moral respect is owed to all and only human persons. And at first glance, I mean, obviously we all care about animals, but at first glance, it can be a little bit difficult to see what is wrong with this definition. I mean, what's wrong with giving rights to people, you know? And the problem comes down to the very word people or persons. Because how do we define that? How are we deciding who's a person and who isn't? And I argue that the very foundation of this decision includes ableist beliefs. So here I just threw up some pictures to make my point. I refer to these two people as people and friends, but many people would look at them and far from even seeing animal, they might see food. And so how are we making these distinctions? Why is one of them, me, a person, and them not? So ableism is connected to all of our struggles because it undergirds notions of whose bodies are considered valuable, desirable, and disposable. And here I bring up the definition of the person again. So based on these decisions of whose bodies are valuable, and I argue that the way we decide who's valuable and who isn't is the way in which they function, and whether that functioning meets societal expectations. Then leads to how we decide who is a person and who isn't, and who is valuable and who isn't. And when I use the term valuable, I'm not using it in an economic sense, I'm using it in a social sense. So to make my point, I have a quite horrific example of a criminal case that recently came to close. It took place in Atalista, Iowa, in which there was an individual who had both a turkey breeding and growing operation and a processing operation. And by processing here we mean kill and dismember, but that's how they like to say. So this person thought that it would be a kind and compassionate idea to go, and this was in the 50s, I should mention, to go into an institution for boys and offer the older ones both a job in either, the growing plant or the killing plant, the slaughterhouse, and housing. And at first glance, while there's problems that he went out and sought people with disabilities, and these men, most of them, their disabilities were cognitive. So, it's a bit problematic, but you think, hey, he's giving them housing, he's giving them a job, what's the problem? And the first problem is that the jobs that they were given are considered some of the dirtiest and hardest in the industry. So they were given one of two jobs. One was to be a puller, which meant to grab the birds either for insemination or milking. And this is because, turkeys cannot breed and reproduce themselves. We have to do it. So either pull them for that, or pull them, pull I mean grab, to take them to the slaughterhouse. The second job was to be a crocker. And this meant that they were working in the slaughterhouse, presumably after the bird had been bled and was dead. And it was their job to pull out the windpipe and the crop. And this is considered one of the dirtiest jobs within the slaughterhouse. So even within slaughterhouse standards, it's considered really nasty, and you don't want to be doing it. And so here's the first problem. These people with disabilities who don't have a lot of options, their only option was to stay in that institution at the time, are given jobs that nobody else wanted. Secondly, they were only paid $65 a month, no matter how many hours they worked. And from this tiny little salary, their medical expenses were taken. So they were really making even less, even though they were helping process about 20,000 turkeys a day. Furthermore, the man who invited these men to come and work for him had absolutely no experience or training in how to work or aid people with disabilities. And so they were severely neglected, to the point where their house ended up infested with roaches and mice. And in the article I was reading, they noted that some of the men, while eating, would hold their hands over their plates so that the roaches wouldn't fall into their food. They also were sleeping on soiled mattresses. Many of them were malnourished and needed other medical or dental attention. And some of the medical attention was the result of the repetitive motion of cropping, so pulling out the windpipe, like I mentioned. So they had arthritis. It was so bad their fingers were curling. And none of this was being addressed by the man who offered them the job. And then, if you can believe it, the situation got even worse. The original farmer died, and somebody else took over, and he was physically and emotionally abusive towards the men. After over 30 years of this going on, this new rancher decided that the men were getting a little bit too slow at their jobs. So he proposed a staggered forced retirement and wanted to have all the men retired by the spring of 2008. The first few ended up in a nursing home, having nowhere else to go. A select lucky few had family members who decided to take them in and support them. And one of them had a sister who noted, hey, my brother worked here for over 30 years and he only has $80 in savings. There is something not right about this. So she contacted a reporter because none of the social workers would take her case for whatever reason. And this is how all of this finally got exposed. So those who didn't, after initial medical care and whatnot, those who didn't have families to go to, they grouped themselves in, groupings of 3 or 4, and now live together. Some of them have jobs. All of them are on Medicaid and Social Security. The court case was recently brought to a close, as I mentioned, and each of the men were awarded $100,000 in back pay. And this is for over 30 years of servitude, pretty much. And, this doesn't even begin to cover the overtime that these men were working because they felt they had to. They were also awarded $240 million in damages. And when I first read this number, I was like, hey, that's something. But there is a law that states that companies with under 101 employees only have to pay up to $1.6 million. So essentially, even though it's great that this was brought to attention, the money they were awarded was pennies compared to the suffering that they went through. And a lot of people will look at this and go, hey, that's an isolated case. Like that abuse can't be going on everywhere. But to a certain degree, it is. So one man who decided to speak to a reporter, this is, completely different newspaper, gave a rundown of his history working with Montfort Beef Company, which is owned by ConAgra. While working there, and this is a list, he had to have back surgery. He inhaled too much chlorine while cleaning blood tanks and spent a month in the hospital because he had burned his lungs and his skin, which blistered. He had a damaged rotator cuff in his left shoulder. He broke a leg. He was hit by a truck, which resulted in a 2-week hospital stay. And they are not getting paid while they're on these medical leaves. Shattered an ankle and needed to have permanent pins in it, and that's when he was finally forced to leave his job. He is now disabled. He views himself as disabled and is living off Social Security. So the golden rule in meatpacking plants is the chain will not stop, and these are why these injuries happen. I work with Toronto Cow Save, and I've spoken to a few workers, who work in a cattle slaughterhouse, which is one of the more dangerous slaughterhouses to work in, as it is not as mechanized. And they pointed out that the line doesn't stop, and these injuries do not get reported if they are simply lacerations or lost fingers. So as you can see, there's not only are the non-humans who are going into these plants, not only are their bodies being disregarded and objectified, literally, as they are cut into pieces, but the people who work there, their bodies, their lives, their minds are completely disregarded. They too are just objects. They're a cog in the machine of agriculture. And I'm going to bring this back to the definition of the person, which is where I started. So the non-human beings who are entering the slaughterhouse, they are not regarded as a person as a result of speciesism, which is a belief system that only human beings are persons. The people who come into the slaughterhouses are not viewed as a person, often because they have disabilities. So again, bringing it back to Toronto Cow Save, many of the people who work there cannot read. And in today's society, that would be viewed as a disability. One man I've also connected with has rheumatoid arthritis and couldn't get a job anywhere else. And that's why he works in the cattle slaughterhouse. And he has suffered multiple injuries as well. And so these people, again, are not viewed as people. They don't meet the definition because they do not have the necessary qualities that are valued by society. The necessary qualities that mean that they are a person as opposed to a not person. So, in conclusion, persons with disabilities, non-human persons, and other marginalized persons are not considered to possess certain socially prized physical and their mental characteristics. So like I mentioned, the characteristic of being able to read, the characteristic of being able to walk, the characteristic of being able to hear, perhaps. They don't have these, and so they are thus relegated to the category of a not person, because you don't have these special prized abilities. And this results in their objectification, their discrimination, their marginalization, and violence against them being considered acceptable, as we saw in the examples of the slaughterhouses. So I just would like to conclude with a quote from Woolgrain, which states that judgment based on abilities is so ingrained in society that its use for exclusionary purposes is hardly ever questioned or realized. And we see this with accessibility issues. For example, the washroom down here, the door is not power operated, and that's not even questioned because ableism is so ingrained in our society. And so I demand that these questions must be asked. So ask why there's not a ramp. Think about it. Ask why the individual with a cognitive disability is not being treated like a person and their consent isn't even being asked for. Demand these questions so that perhaps we can then begin challenging the system of ableism itself and thus challenge the system of speciesism. Thank you.
So the last presenter on this panel is Nocella. He's a visiting professor in the School of Education at Hamline University, and his presentation is titled A Movement of Oppressors, a Critical Eco-Ability Perspective on Narcissism and the Savior Mentality in the Animal Episode.
Okay. So I'm supposed to be in front of this live stream. I've got to fix it. As a narcissist, I've got to fix this. Make sure people see me. My name's Anthony. I'm really excited about this panel and, the engagement on disability issues. And there's this panel, and then there's a panel tomorrow. Some of this work is coming out of an old text, not old, 2012, 13, on eco-ability, which was the first connection between disability and animals. And now we had a conference. Joe and Judy Bentley and Kim Socha are putting together a special issue that should be coming out soon in the Journal for Critical Animal Studies, and a number of people possibly in this room are going to be in it. And so there's a lot of discussion, and I think if we're going to talk about, moving this movement forward, we're not just critiquing this movement, we're trying to make it inclusive and larger. And so this movement is 100% made up of oppressors, right? From a non-human perspective, we have to acknowledge that the only other movement in modern human history is the environmental movement, right? And so So that's kind of, I wanted to title it A Movement of Oppressors, because will we ever win? And that's kind of one of the questions, and will the animals ever win? And people always say, well, what do you think the animals want? And, you know, to be crass and to be really blunt, they probably don't want us on this planet. And, you know, if you get away from an oil spill, nature will clean itself a lot better than humans getting in there with 100 machines. Or, you know, the Exxon Valdez, you know, oil leak, you know, a lot of things. The Gulf Coast with the BP. The natural environment has cleaned itself a lot better. The environment, the biosphere, and, you know, the ecosystem is more in balance when we take the humans out of the picture of an ecological system, right? But you put humans back into that ecological system, and we're completely off balance. One species, you take off this planet, and the world becomes a better place. You take these off this planet, the world will collapse. You take a number of other species off this planet, and the world will collapse as we know it. So I wanted to kind of talk about why, you know, the narcissism and the savior mentality comes from being in a movement where the oppressed is not checking us and putting us and challenging us and questioning us. And so we get to have free-for-all and making ourselves feel good at the end of the day. And so me being a person with disabilities, as you know, I've seen you know, that being carried out specifically in the pity mentality when it comes to Special Olympics. When people think they're doing good, but in actuality, they're actually oppressing us even more. So the outline for unilateral or lateral thinkers, I'm focusing specifically on introducing eco-ability, and I'll talk a little bit about that from my perspective, because I think eco-ability is now really developed in a variety of different perspectives, and I'm really excited. Similar to ecofeminism or environmental justice. And then I'll talk a little bit about what it means, you know, to engage in an oppressor movement, examples of narcissism, examples of the savior mentality within specifically the animal liberation, animal advocacy, animal rights, whatever you want to call it, movement. What we can do to challenge oppression, what we can do to challenge narcissism, and what we can do to challenge savior mentality. And remember, throw out the animal liberation, you know, if you want. If you know, let's say you're not vegan here, and you're not interested in being vegan, that's fine. If you're interested in economic justice, racial justice, youth justice, these specific, you know, things that I'll be challenging will be able to be engaged in other movements, right? So, birth defects, this is the beginning of this eco-ability, kind of looking at the normals, as you were kind of talking about, is, you know, sterilization. And the birth defects is, you know, noting that what is a healthy baby, you know, and the idea of a healthy baby versus a non-healthy baby. So right at the beginning, we have created a binary of what is normal and what is abnormal. And this binary, we have normal, which is an able-bodied Christian that is a male that's U.S. You know, born or European born, and formally educated, wealthy, you know, heterosexual. And then over here is a person of color that is not Christian, maybe atheist even, how dare they, and that's not physically or mentally able-bodied or mind-bodied or, you know, able-minded. And so we have to look at all of the things over here and all the things over here. And the field of study that really broke down this binary is disability studies, right? And so we're gonna, you know, look at that and how, if, you know, when I'm teaching a course, I ask people, I say, hey, raise your hand if you know, and, you know, most of the students is, you know, if you had a child of another race, raise your hand. If you weren't expecting it, right? You know, and you were with a partner that was of the same race you are, and your baby came out and was of a different race, who would have an abortion? They were like, what? That's a weird question, Anthony. Why would you ask that? Then I asked her, I said, raise your hand if you would have an abortion if your child was gay. You know, maybe in other parts of this world and country, you know, people might actually raise their hand and say, yes, you know, I would have an abortion. But without a doubt, I always get the common defense of saying, Well, if your child has Down syndrome, if your child has some mental, physical disability, it's, severe. Well, the answer and the defense of that, of having an abortion for somebody with disabilities, one, it's going to be hard for them. Two, it's going to be hard for me. And three, it's going to be hard for the people around them, right? Rather than saying, society needs to change, I need to change, and the kid doesn't need to change, right? And I think that's what we have to, really begin to, look at. That's kind of where I wanted to begin. And here's some ideas of eco-ability, and, the book is out there. Looking at difference rather than the, sameness and equality. We're not looking for equality because equality is a measurement that is socially constructed. If I gave everyone equal measurements of Redolin, I don't think everybody would be fine in this room. But if I gave everyone an equitable amount of Redolin, which would actually be 0 to 100 milligrams or 200 milligrams, then I think that would be equitable, right? So we look at those things. We look at holistic transformation and dialogue, intersectionality, using this technology for justice, not just to play video games in your Xbox. If you're going to use technology, we have to understand that we also are clear-cutting, mountains in Africa, and that is destroying ecosystems, but it's also destroying the gorilla habitat when we use our cell phones. So none of us in this room or at this conference or any conference are vegan, right? If we're using a car, if we're using a cell phone, if we're using a computer, we are not, we're looking at the betterment of what we could use for this technology. So when you use this technology, try to use it for the betterment of the world and those gorillas and those children that are mining that, those very lethal minerals, right? So those are, some of the points. So kind of, really specifically, and I'll kind of go through this really quick, animal liberation, disability liberation, earth liberation. Liberation, we have to reclaim it. A lot of people in the women's studies and the gender studies, such as Vandana Shiva and Sanjay Mohante and Angela Davis have really argued that we shouldn't be saying studies, we should be saying liberation. And studies is an institutionalization of a movement. Right? So now I'm kind of going into kind of critiques, and then I'll kind of go into the narcissism and the savior mentality and what we can do about it. So I would, speak about, a number of other people, but I think we have to look at freak. And when it comes back to the ecological as well as racist analysis of the freak, right? So, hello, my name is, Vegan Freak, and they were trying to do a, pun on that. But, when looking at that, they're also identifying themselves as a freak, and that, in a playful manner, right? And they never discuss in the book the complexities of using that word. So Bob Bogdan, one of the founders of disability studies, and a former professor of mine, he kind of notes two things. Freak is a term historically applied to those with disabilities, period. As defined by Robert Bogdan in Freak Show, a freak has historically been referred to as either those that have not colonial and European, such as natives, First Nations, and indigenous groups, or, as we all know, the second major category of exhibit, the freak show, consists of the monster, the physical, people with disabilities. So when we look at, and I write in, a number of articles, is that our modern animal rights movement is inherently and historically ableist because of this individual, right? He's quoted more often than anybody else, but he's asking for this, right? He's asking for the elimination of those with disabilities for the betterment of the masses, utilitarian perspective, right? And he, kind of notes that. And ADAPT, anybody knows that organization, ADAPT? Of course, she does. She was involved in it. It's an organization on disability liberation, and they would protest Peter Singer as the #1 enemy when he was hired at Princeton, and then L.A. Claire, when Peter spoke up in Vermont, he was protested by L.A. And a number of other people. And so wherever he goes, he is typically protested by the disability community, right? He is one of our major figures within our movement globally, and he is protested. And so if you say, hey, I'm an animal rights activist to a person with disabilities, the number one thing you'll get is get away from me, right? Because you are a symbol of Peter Singer, right? And we have to start challenging that with our movement, if that makes sense, right? And there's a lot of racism and homophobia with our movement and sexism, and we've been challenging a number of those things in the recent years, right? So now, you know, and there's a lot of other things to critique in our movement, but I wanted to kind of give a quick 101 overview. And so the oppressor movement, a movement or a struggle, right? So if I was to, you know, stand right here as, you know, a movement is this. It goes anywhere, right? It's dancing, right? And those are individuals that are not oppressed. A struggle is something that you don't have a volunteer ability to leave or come, right? So the animals are in a struggle. The non-human animals are in a struggle. We are a voluntary movement. We can leave at any time. Thus, we talk about burnout, right? People of color in racial justice movements don't have long conversations about burnout because they can't leave those, you know, identities, right? Economic justice or people with disabilities, you can't leave. So burnout, which is a term, you know, very much constructed and used specifically, and it began to be used in the business world. And then it was adopted by the nonprofit industrial complex world. And then now in the grassroots world, and how to keep people involved, right? And we need to understand we're fighting for our lives and their lives. And when we understand, you know, how it's interconnected, then we understand, you know, how we cannot leave this movement, right? But we do have that opportunity. I could stop being vegan right this second. I can stop being involved in this movement right this second, and I can guarantee you my life will get better, you know, around me. I will get jobs easier, right? I will, you know, have less conflicts within my family. I will have less conflicts with my friends, et cetera, et cetera. So where's the voice of the oppressed? We can't hear the voice of the oppressed many of the times. We hear them screaming on Meet Your Beat when we turn the videos off. What would the animals do? And that's a major question that everybody asks, from HSUS in Defense of Animals to myself. What would animals do? And everyone has a different argument, right? And so some people would say they would shoot everybody. And some people would say they would liberate everybody. Some people would say they would, you know, they would do something strategic and thoughtful, and we have to, you know, look at the long term of this. This is not a movement that's going to be short term, so we shouldn't be reactionary, right? We shouldn't be animalistic. We should be, you know, civilized and thoughtful about our actions. So we have to really question that, because we will never hear from an animal, non-human animal, what they want, right? So we are now, again, putting our own thoughts into this movement and owning this movement. Will they ever, I was about to say when, so when. Will they ever win, or will we ever win? And I think we will win, but they will not win. We will win, we'll have Whole Foods everywhere. We'll have Trader Joe's everywhere. We'll have highways that are more ecologically sustainable. We'll have hiking trails that are a little shorter and smaller. We'll have a lot of things that are green around us, and we'll feel like we're making a less impact, but that's not what they're asking, right? So, again, when we make our analogies, you know, from people with disabilities or not, when we make our analogies, we repress the other, right? And we say that your experience is like my experience. Well, no. From a feminist perspective, we understand that your experience is different than my experience, and we don't have to make analogies. We have to make a good argument, right? No more elevator speeches, no more, you know, analogizing on, you know, how elephants are similar to slavery in Africa. We don't have to do that because we have to respect different people's experiences. And I've tried seeing this, you know, occur repetitively in other movements, and what I've seen is failure over and over again. And letters from the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., you know, addressing PETA, etc. So here's some examples really quick. And, you know, Drew, I just see him over there, he was very involved in this, and a number of other people, and kind of beginning to work with Idle No More and challenging the, if a vegan Thanksgiving is even possible, right? Because it's historically rooted in genocide. So again, if we go vegan, we have to look at, you know, where we're getting our bananas, which is, again, slave crop many times, like the farm. I'm going to skip this. Okay, here. Narcissism. Praising yourself, including myself, having a website, having a CV, having a resume, even putting my name on this presentation. Why do we do it? Because I want credit, right? Having copyrights on books, that is part of narcissism, right? Having pictures of yourself on your website, that is narcissism. Using your name rather than the movement's name. Why is it so important? Having awards, right? We do give awards at ICAST, but, and we still will, possibly, right? But we have to understand this narcissism of getting awards, giving awards, and the praise that we seek, right? Hollywood celebrities and movement celebrities. In looking at other movements from racial justice, youth justice, school prison pipeline, disability, etc., globally, we have more celebrities, Hollywood celebrities, and personalities in our movement than any other movement currently, right? And we have to understand, why is that possible? Well, the oppressed is not involved in, having a voice. So we claim the spotlight, right? Jealousy, it's thick and deep in our movement, and we have a lot of infighting within our movement compared to other movements, and many people have said this, individualism, we have a lot of individualism, a lot of leadership, a lot of men taking the reign, of the animal movement, while 70 to 80% of this movement are, typically white females, right, globally. And we have to understand that we are a microcosm of the world, because we haven't included the oppressor's voice, the oppressed voice. Exploitive, opportunistic, unwilling to share. So here's an example of this narcissism played out. It's about me. It's not about the animals. It's about being sexy. So stop being a moron and start getting skinny, because it's about being skinny and sexy, this movement. And that is the last 4 years that, the vegan kind of movement within the animal liberation movement has all been about, is being pretty and sexy. And we can see this through Vegans Are Sexy, the Sexy Vegan Cookbook. And of course, you don't want to be autistic, because that's wrong. So we have PETA now critiquing autism and the autistic community, right? So we're doing a heck of a job of being inclusive to the disability community. We have Pamela Anderson airbrushed, and then of course you don't want to look like a whale. And then this, I have 2 more slides and then I'm done. The savior mentality is an outsider coming in, for, not with, profiting, those individuals that are profiting. We have so many individuals in our movement that make money, and we haven't even asked the oppressed if that's fine, right? A leader, open rescues, possibly a savior mentality. We're taking pictures with animals. The whole concept of the sanctuary, right? Of so many people taking pictures and protecting and providing space with animals. Leader, and that whole concept of guilt, and the name of organizations, the voice of the voiceless, for example. So here's some examples of the savior mentality played out by celebrities, right? We see Special Olympics in the corner. We have Madonna. We have, of course, Brad Pitt, and then we have Paul McCartney with animals. And we have to understand this whole savior mentality is ingrained in this movement because there's no engagement or dialogue with the oppressed. And so, I will kind of conclude right there, and we can have a conversation. But it's the beginning of a conversation, and I think other people have had it in a variety of other ways. I think, I want to really talk about this concept of narcissism, including myself, that I've been part of it, and I supported it, and this whole concept of savior mentality. And I don't know how to end it, but I know we need to first address it. So I'll let you all answer how do we end it. Thanks.
So we'll now open up for questions and answers, and if you have a question, I'll run around, give you the microphone so that way everyone can hear. I want to thank the 3 panelists because I thought they all did an amazing job sort of explaining eco-ability and talking about it from distinct angles. So with that, does anyone have questions that they would like to ask?
Hey, this just starting to deal with some of these concepts, so this is probably going to be kind of like a naive exploration of what you just presented. But in terms of the savior mentality, it seems to me like the construct that's required there is that you have one person who can and something that cannot, and can never, achieve the same level of ability in that dimension as the person who can, and therefore becomes dependent and reliant on the other person to perform or rescue, them in that situation. Okay, I mean, it seems to me that there are dynamics where that exists. You can have, a husband and wife who've been healthy and together, for 70 or 80 years, and then the wife has a stroke, and all of a sudden, it's pretty clear that the husband's going to have to do everything where the wife isn't going to survive. And, okay, so that's, one part of that dynamic. There are other parts where the actions become self-perpetuating. So by entering into the role of savior, then that person never gets out of a relationship, or, where they're doing that with the other thing, whether it's an animal or a person. And those might be the particular relationships that become more ethically problematic, because their behavior, while well-meaning, is, is going to perpetuate a power dynamic which is never going to change. So, I guess, comments on those comments?
I'll make a quick comment. And I had a lot to, go over and articulate. And I think the idea that this partnership, this human partnership that you gave an example of, is a partnership that began on an interdependent relationship, while the savior mentality is coming from an external relationship that is put onto another without any voluntary acceptance of that relationship, and a fully understanding that what this relationship is entailed. And I think that's the difference between, let's say, as you were saying, the wife gets sick and the husband takes care of the wife, and I think that is a relationship that was based on interdependency, while the savior mentality is a external person coming into another person's community without being asked, and that is the foundation of a savior mentality. While I think that's I hope that makes a clear distinction.
To bounce off of your comment just now, it made me immediately picture, and you had mentioned, Nicholas, rescue groups, I think. Made me immediately picture the magnetic stickers on the back of some cars, where it's with a dog print or paw print, and it says who rescued whom. Have you seen those? Do you know what I'm talking about? Okay. Yeah, so it makes me think of you're talking about the perpetual savior. If you're in that position, and that just perpetuates. And then you see those stickers where it's like, okay, well, I went and I rescued him, but I'm actually being rescued myself. And you might give that some credibility, but it just doesn't seem genuine. And I'm wondering if that's just because it's the person in power asking the question or posing that question, well, now I'm being saved, or people who help those who are disabled or give charity and say, well, actually, I'm the one that was being helped in the end, or I've learned more, or I've felt better, or this or that. So, is it possible to get out of that perpetual savior position, or is it really just not genuine? Because still it's the person that was in power making these comments, coming to that realization, or making that statement.
I would say that savior mentality is a slang term, like bullying. It's a slang term for talking about oppression. But I think the philosophical term behind it is pity, and which you spoke about. So I don't know if you want to elaborate on how to destroy pity within our movement.
Okay, that kind of made more sense because I'm thinking now, you're still othering the whoever it is. And so beneath that you have the pity still.
Other questions?
Thanks for the talks. I learned a lot from them. I was interested in the discussion about emotion and reason, and thinking through your discussion of how we feel to people, and you mentioned that we can do that with logos, we can build the rationality as well. And I also understood the distinction between compassion and pity. I think some pity is a corrupt form of compassion. But I also wonder how we're going to convince people without an appeal in the end to their ability to feel emotion, to be moved, and so forth. I imagine that if we're appealing to not other philosophers in a certain tradition in philosophy, we're going to convince very few people, unless we can some level of people to their capacity to feel and to be moved and so forth. So it's interesting what any of you have to say about how do we go about appealing. I mean, one thing you don't want to do is to appeal to people in a way which is, as it were, corrupt, because it appeals to say their capacity for pity rather than genuine compassion. So how are we to appeal to them in the right way and in a way which may be successful? I'm interested in this because I wonder if an appeal to rationality, and I know Anthony mentioned Peter Singer before. Peter Singer wants to appeal at no level to a person's emotion, and that's fundamental to his point of view in a sense, that he wants to appeal to their reason, not to their emotion. But he also says, he's also said more recently, not in the 70s, but more recently, that he's very disappointed with the effect of his book, in a way, or the lack of effect that people haven't been convinced in the way that he thought was possible. And so he, in some way, there's the question again of whether or not we appeal to rationality or we appeal to emotion. But anyway, that's I don't want to be too long. I was interested in the whole discussion.
I think that there are other emotions that we can maybe harness, especially in the advertisements. So instead of lending our imaginations to fear and pity, both, that maybe we could, seek to entice viewers by encouraging, compassion in other means, maybe. But I also think that maybe we could do it in a more lighthearted fashion. I mean, these commercials, I'm sure you've all seen them, they're horrible. I mean, they're really scary. People do turn the channel. They don't want to watch these things. They don't want to recognize that it exists. So while it's important that we know it exists, I think we certainly could do it maybe in a more, I don't know what the word is I'm trying to find, but it just reminds me of like a horror story, seeing these commercials, maybe in a way that we can explore it in a more lighthearted fashion, or something of the sort. Yeah. I appreciate your comments, though.
All right, right here. I just wanted to add that if we're talking about logic in the sense that it is truth, I mean, obviously we want our advertisements to be truthful, and I think sometimes where we slip up on that is in exaggerating. But what I more wanted to speak to is this idea of logic versus emotion, as opposed to them existing cohesively and being able to use them at the same time within the same commercial. And I mean, I used to have this in my slides, but I didn't have time to mention it. But this whole idea of logic being better than the emotion is a patriarchal, sexist notion. And it's how women who are more associated with emotionality are, you know, sort of oppressed. I can't believe I forgot that word. But it's by saying, well, they're not rational. I mean, how many times have you heard that? You're not being rational, so I won't listen to you, or whatnot. And it's also something that people say about animals. They're not capable of rational thought, therefore they are lesser. And again, I would tie in ableism, this whole idea of, you know, you're not capable of rational thought, you don't have this capability that we're looking for, so we're going to put you over here where you're not exactly human, you're not exactly the rational white man. So I think perhaps, to answer your question, melding the three really, instead of pitting them against each other, would be an effective way to reach out.
Thank you all, that was really interesting. So my question is about something you said, Anthony, about burnout, and I understand what you're saying, but I really take issue with looking at burnout in a way where it can be oppressive to people with mental illness within our own movement. And so I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about that, about how we could address people. We do have the ability, we chose to join this movement, so we have the ability to just choose to leave. How do we address that without perpetuating ableism towards mental illness? And people in our movement who have depression, they might need to take time off, and we need to be okay with that. So I'm wondering if you have thoughts about that.
I don't think that, again, is the disability movement, right? So I don't think it has anything to do with non-human animals and burning out a non-human animal movement. It has something to do with having the non-human animal movement address disabilities within it. And once we understand that we shouldn't have a conference that is so packed with so much things that causes anxiety, that we have a schedule of so many things, that we have deadlines, that we have efficiency and effectiveness models within organizations and nonprofits, that how we function through Skype and through different forms of communication, through email, can cause depression, and just somebody getting out of their house might take 3 hours, and if they're late to an event or a conference, then we get down on them, and then they have burnout. Well, it has nothing to do with them being wrong. It has everything to do with this movement of being ableist. And so that person has nothing to change. And so we put the victimization on that person of being wrong, just like bullying when it comes to young kids, that when a young kid bullies another kid, well, they did something wrong. Well, no, adults and the system need to take responsibility for constructing oppression, because the 4 groups that are typically bullied in our whole country are typically the same people that are being pushed out of school and the prisons, which is LGBT, economically disadvantaged, kids of color, and kids with disabilities. So I think the movement and the systems and, you know, those able-bodied people need to take responsibility for why they're burning out these people. Because we have so many people in our movement with disabilities that come out, at least tell me, but they get kicked out really quick for being the crazy freak, idiot, moron. And I hear so many able-bodied, like people saying, I can't do this movement. Why do we have so many freaks in this movement? You know, like, I can't believe it. We have, you know, and I think because, you know, first they feel that they can help somebody. Like, somebody with disabilities can't help anybody. That's what the disability community feels like, oh, I can't help anybody, but then they say, I can help non-human animals. And then able-bodied people say, no, you can't. You can't do it as efficient. You can't make a poster as efficient. You can't make a website, so get out of here. You know, so, I mean, I think this conference, while, you know, I'm a person very strong with, you know, and we're very strong around disability, this is a very ableist conference. You know, we don't have sign language. We don't have open bathrooms. We have doors, you know, a variety of things. So we have to keep on pushing ourselves and calling ourselves out. You know, and I can see why a number of people with disabilities wouldn't come to this conference. Wouldn't come to this movement either. I hope that answered.
Hey, I was thinking about the savior mentality and interspecies relationships, and I'm one of those people that actually thinks that even though I live with a cat, I'm actually one of those people that thinks that there's something kind of corrupt in companion animal and human relationships. And there's an element of caretakerness in those relationships and in savior mentality. And so I'm thinking about the effective dimension of the savior mentality and wondering then what other affects are involved besides pity. Just because in caretaker relationships with companion animals, there's something beyond pity, and I'm just thinking about it. I don't have an answer. It's just, I was wondering like what some of those, you know, what some of those other affects might be. Do you guys think about it?
I think, yeah, independency. I mean, that's a big part of, you know, with disability, people with disabilities feeling like they have to be dependent on others or expecting to be dependent on others. I think also just the sense of helplessness too, that, you know, it's kind of echoing what we've already, the terms we've been using tonight, but, you know, here's this helpless animal, here's this helpless person with a disability. So I think there's definitely a lot of overlap, and I think you should speak to comments about having we were just talking about this earlier.
Okay, so I just wanted to, in answer to that question, point out that the reason that a lot of people, and again, I include animals when I say that, a lot of people, the reason why they're dependent has to do not with them, like what you're saying, it's not them, it's the social structures. So with companion animals, we took them however many years ago out of the wild and domesticated them so far that they can no longer fend for themselves. You know, if you take your little hamster and put him out in the wild, he's going to have no idea what to do. And it's very similar with people with disabilities. And again, this isn't for everyone with disability who feels this way, but a lot of people with disabilities, I've learned in discussion, the main reason they call themselves disabled is because they feel disabled by the social and architectural structures in our society. And then that's where the dependency comes in. So again, not from them, it's the structure that's problematic. And so I feel like we're kind of caught where we have to look after these persons, but it's because of structures that we have created and that we can also dismantle. So.
Hi, thank you. I wanted to follow up on what you were just saying, Mary, about this idea of disability, and I was thinking of Sonora Taylor's distinction between impairment and disability, and I thought that, actually I thought that what you just said now was really important and something that I would like to see maybe in your definition of disability. I'd like to see you talk about it. because when you were giving your presentation, you talked about it as basically a choice. You can choose to say you're disabled or not, and I appreciate that on multiple levels in some respects, but if thinking about it through Stigall and Taylor's like distinction between impairment and disability, it's interesting to think about like someone who uses a wheelchair might not see that as an impairment, but may then still be disabled through society because the impairment for her would be like a physical condition, but disability is like the social structure of oppression. So that was something that I thought was, I don't actually know, I haven't had enough time to really think about how I felt about what you said, but I guess made me a little bit nervous to see a definition of disability be something that could be a choice, whether or not someone is disabled. I mean, in terms of identity politics, like yes, I understand to like choose to embrace it as a term, but I thought that made me a little bit nervous in terms of the political issues with like disability being a structural and political situation. And I was wondering if you could speak to that for a second.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I'm sorry if it wasn't clear and perhaps I lingered on one aspect of my definition too long instead of the other one. But I do believe that more often than not, when somebody is labeled as disabled, it's not at all their choice. So when I'm walking around with a cane and somebody calls me a cripple, that's not a choice. I've been labeled, I've been boxed. And that occurs, that can be, a building can, throw that in someone's face. You are disabled because you cannot come into this building. And that is not a choice. And I feel like more often than not, and again, it's through discussions with other people that I've realized this, more often than not, that's how they end up coming to, or ending up with the label disabled, is as a result of these barriers or as a result of direct discrimination or forced labeling. I just added the second part to include people with quote-unquote invisible disabilities. But you're absolutely right. More often than not, it's not something that you can choose, like you were saying. I can't just jump out of the disability category. So I hope that clears it up. Yeah.
So this is going to be the last question because we have to wrap up at this point.
Thank you. I'm just wondering, following up with Anthony's ideas about the savior mentality and the movement of oppressors, which I think is really important. And with that, the ideas about so much of that is always linked to oppressors talking at groups of oppressed and not really engaging with or about them in a different space that they're not really don't have access to. And so I think, one of the ways that you can correct this is by engaging with these groups in a space that they can participate in and just be present. And just going off of ideas that Mary was just speaking about right now with basic architectural access. I'm just wondering, when we're talking about animal liberation, I feel like it's always so noticeable for me that there's no animals ever, when we're having these conversations, they're completely absent. We're talking about them as if they're abstract objects. And even with these buildings, I'm sure this one.
Oh, we got some
Well, yeah, but I'm sure a lot of buildings don't allow access to animals unless they're specific. And so just even with that, then a lot of the mentality again is that, it's voice for the voiceless. It seems so much of that disability logic where we're saying that because they have these faults, we need to speak for them. So I'm just wondering, does anyone have any suggestions for how to shift these conversations where we're actually engaging with the animals and not so much just with each other as aggressors?
I think it's moving that way. I think that There is these dog whisperers and horse whisperers and, you know, people that I think, you know, we have to think hundreds and hundreds of years ago, we, you know, like the people in this room, we don't know Spanish. We learn Spanish. Like, we will, without a doubt, in 20 years, know languages of other species. And we have that ability. If we have the ability to learn Spanish and English, and very difficult, you know, things that I don't know. I'm still learning English. But I think that if you're hanging out with, let's say, a cat I have, I understand that I don't know what the cat is saying, you know, for example, Shadow, but I understand that Shadow meows in like 13 different ways. And sometimes that meow means happy, and sometimes that meow means like, so I think everybody understands that. So we've passed the like Cat 101 of language. Now we have to get to like some very more difficult, complex things, which this conference and many scholars within critical studies, nobody has really done yet. Like really talked about the meow, talked about, because we really can't move forward and eliminate being the oppressor movement until we say, yo, let's cancel all the campaigns right now. We're not winning anything like tomorrow, which is sad, but for every one vegan we get, 20,000 McDonald's pop up. So like we can take off a month and start learning other like species language. And if we do that, we gain 20,000 years of not being oppressors anymore. But if we say, screw it, like, you know, let's just keep on doing what we do, and, you know, you sound cuckoo and spiritual and holistic and like, what are you, some pagan? I think that's really, you know, breaking down that barrier of patriarchal, sexist, ableist, you know, dichotomy that we've constructed in our movement, if that makes sense. But yeah, I would say that I would love to see movements that are like vegan outreach, humane education, and interspecies dialogues, you know, and see how many people would show up. I bet you just kooky people.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a quick comment. I think the important thing in learning and starting these interspecies dialogues is listening and also valuing different abilities, capabilities, moments, situations. So, you know, with my two friends that I put up there, one's a turkey and one is a bovine, if you are interacting with them and you're just talking at them the whole time and not listening, then I would say you're not learning and you're in the role of the oppressor. But if you just sit and watch and listen and try to learn and try and get rid of all your preconceived notions about who they are, then I think some really magical things can happen. And again, now I sound like one of those kooky people, but I really, really believe in that. And obviously not everyone has access to these interactions. You know, not everyone has this time. Somebody who has 3 or 4 jobs and is trying to be vegan, you know, they don't have the time like I do, you know, to go and that's not their fault. So again, it's about recognizing these structures, recognizing the problematic within these structures, and starting to break them down. And if you are lucky enough to have that time, take it. But a really simple action you could take, if you don't have that time, is just by not using that language of voice for the voiceless. I see it everywhere. So calling people out who use it and explaining why, you know, it's oppressive. I think that's a huge first step. Yeah.
All right, so we're going to have to wrap it up here. I liked everyone's questions and great answers. There's going to be another panel on eco-mobility tomorrow, so we'll be able to keep up those threads, and if people have more questions, you can be able to ask on those. Tomorrow at 8:30 is where we're going to start serving breakfast here. 9:30 is when panels will actually start. So, you know, anytime between 8:30 and 9:30, feel free to, you know, filter in and, you know, grab whatever it is that you're doing. So, thank you all for coming, and we'll see you tomorrow.